Welcome back to Rewind of the Living Dead. I'm Damon Martin.
And I'm Patrick Guerra.
And Patrick, we are back for the attack with another new film in 2023 with Kevin Williamson's Sick.
Sick. Speaking of sick, bro, how sick is it that we're on YouTube now?
I know, right? We're actually on YouTube. I know, listen, before anyone says it, I know I have a face built for radio, okay? I'm just telling you ahead of time. But this is a horror movie podcast, so if I scare you a little bit, that's probably good.
I mean, that's the point.
We are on YouTube officially. We have uploaded a couple episodes. Every new episode will now be going on YouTube, but we will be uploading past episodes. Will not be video, and meaning you won't see Patrick or I, but you will hear the podcast because this is something new we're doing. So the video will be of the new episodes. The old episodes will be just the audio with, you'll still be able to listen to them, but you just won't see our wonderful faces.
You know what we need, Damon? We need ourselves a YouTube producer. I know you got buddies out there that are very skilled at all this, that need to basically upload our mugs to YouTube so everyone can get us in the full horror glory.
You know what I feel like we need? You know what I feel like we need? I feel like we need to find someone who's got way too much time on their hands.
Yes.
Take past episodes and go full Phil Tippett and just make animated versions of them. And do like animated versions of the podcast with like stop motion animation.
Oh,
that'd be awesome.
That would be fantastic. Just full on Rewind of the Living Dead meets Mad God and just go super weird with it. I want to see myself as some sort of a claymation thing at some point.
You know, I rewatched a movie the other night. I was looking for something to watch, and I was kind of in the mood to watch a classic, and I hadn't watched it in years. So I sat down and rewatched Evil Dead 2 because we did our reaction to the Evil Dead Rise trailer, which now comes out. The movie comes out in April. And I hadn't watched Evil Dead 2 in a lot of years. I've seen it multiple times, but it had been at least 15 years since I watched this movie. And I'm not going to sit here and go into a full Evil Dead 2 review, but I had kind of forgotten about how much like stop motion animation and things were in those movies. And it was kind of funny to me because it reminded me, because I know you watched that movie by Phil Tippett, the one that's on Shudder right now. Is it called Mad God? Is that what it's called?
Mad God, yes.
Mad God. And it reminded me, because that was one of the biggest moments of those films with the stop motion animation and things like that they used. It was just fun to watch it and see it. And again, I hadn't seen the movie in 15 years, maybe longer. It may have been longer since I'd seen Evil Dead 2. But it was just funny to rewatch it, not necessarily under a critical eye, as we always say on this show, but just to kind of watch it and kind of relive it for the first time. And it was just fun. And seeing some of the stop motion animation was cracking me up in that film, purposefully bad, you have to imagine, but also, budget restraints and things like that. But I kind of started to understand a little bit more of the attraction to Evil Dead 2, even though I'm the guy who has constantly said I don't like ironically funny movies. I don't like movies that are so bad everyone thinks they're hilarious, right? I came around a little bit on Evil Dead 2 this time around, but the stop motion animation made me think of that. So, yeah, if we got any stop motion animation people out there who want to spend, way too much of your free time animating our past episodes, I'm all for it.
We're going to get a note like, hey, can you cut the episodes down to 20 minutes? Jesus Christ, you guys are long-winded.
Yeah, so, I feel like there's a puppeteer somewhere out there who has way too much time on their hands. They want to make some really weird videos for YouTube, and that's a good way to get out there. But until then, we will have audio from past episodes going up until we find our own Phil Tippett, who will be willing to stop motion animate us into that form. But we are on YouTube now. It is just youtube.com at Rewind of the Living Dead. Easy to find us. That's our
easy
name.
enough.
Yep.
You know us and you love us, and some of you have been begging us to be on YouTube for almost 3 years now. So now we are.
It should speak to the I consider myself a very technologically savvy person. I am I have the inside of a MacBook Pro tattooed on my arm. I'm way into technology. But as much as I am into technology, I was completely unaware how big podcasting was on YouTube. I didn't realize how huge it was. It's the number one format for podcasts. It's bigger than Spotify. It's bigger than Apple Podcasts. I always equate YouTube to video, and it doesn't click in my head that people would just go there to listen, to a podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's huge. And so it took us almost 4 years to get on there, but we're finally on there.
Yes, we needed to buy time, and we have very little of it.
Yeah. Better late than never. That's what we say around here.
Yeah, I guess so. Shit.
So the new movie Sick is open. It's on Peacock right now. It was a movie I mentioned in our Best of 2020 show. We looked ahead at 2023, and I said one of the movies I was most looking forward to this year was this one because I'm a big Kevin Williamson fan. Of course, Scream is one of my favorite horror franchises. I Know What You Did Last Summer. I love The Faculty. I love a lot of his work. And so I was real excited, and it debuted last year at the Toronto International Film Festival. It got really solid reviews. I saw it on a couple of the horror sites I visit, including Bloody Disgusting. They gave reviews, but then it hadn't secured a distributor. So I wasn't sure when we were going to see it. Like I had no idea. And then literally like a week after our show debuted, I saw that Blumhouse had picked it up and it was going to debut on Peacock as part of that deal they have with Peacock. And so I was like, oh wow. And so it came out much faster than I thought it would. I figured it would be months before I would actually set eyes on this film. And it dropped. And it's weird because you would think Kevin Williamson is a big enough name in the industry that where he wouldn't have, I wouldn't say struggle, but like to where he wouldn't be like debuting films without studio help or whatever. It's kind of weird because he's such a well-known commodity in the horror community. I was kind of surprised by that.
I have a theory why this movie had a trouble finding a home.
Okay.
I think it has a little bit of an agenda that's not terribly popular.
Maybe I can see where you're going. I can see where you're going with that, and
Yeah.
I will say this: as we teased in the intro, if you haven't seen Sick, it takes place at the very start of the global pandemic, April 2020. March is when everything kind of went haywire. April is when this film takes place in 2020, and I'm telling you what, there were so many moments there. This is not a spoiler, but just to be clear, there's a moment that takes place early in this movie where a character goes to a grocery store and they're out of everything and like people are fighting for the last box of tissues and like all. It gave me PTSD. I'm not kidding because I remember that at the beginning of the pandemic, like when you couldn't buy toilet paper
Yeah.
and like people were buying like hoarding, supplies that didn't need to be hoarded, but we were all in that mode of like, oh my god, we got to buy everything in the store. I'm not kidding. Like I was feeling like trauma in that moment. I was like, oh my, this is too soon. This is too real because I like it feels. It was 2 years, it's almost 3 years ago at this point, but it feels a lifetime ago. Like it feels so long
Yeah.
ago. But when I saw it in the movie, boy, did it snap me right back into what it was like in that time and period when things were locking down and you're going to stores, you can't find anything. Like I was seriously feeling trauma watching this. I was like, oh no, no, not again, not again.
It's not fun to revisit these things. And the wounds are still fresh. It's still going on. It's still happening out there. There are still shelves that are like not fully stocked. It's that eggs as we speak are a rich man's game right now. If you got eggs in your house, you're clearly doing well. Yeah, I think there's a bit of messaging in this movie, and it's not like super strong. But if you're like myself and Damon, you have a kind of your mind tuned to what these stories are trying to say. Uh, I think this story was kind of trying to say that everybody was being a little overreactive. I think, like it sort of it seemed to me that a the perspective of either Kevin Williamson or the directors and producers. I mean, Kevin wrote it, so it seemed like a little bit of his perspective was like, if you freaked out about COVID, you're kind of not an idiot, but maybe like you just. I mean, maybe he was thinking that. It kind of came across that way. Like if you think you needed to wear a mask and if you think you needed a distance, you're just kind of being obnoxious. I think obnoxious is more what his angle was, which okay, that's different than saying idiot, but that seemed to be in there. That seemed to be kind of laced into anything that was COVID related. Now, the second problem with that is that once I really got through Sick, COVID didn't really matter to the story, except for, I guess, the end, which we will get to in spoilers. I think you could have reworked this movie any other way. I don't think you needed to use COVID as your setting, as your backdrop. They decided to do it, okay? And maybe I'm reading into it because that's basically what I do for Ryan of the Living Dead. Is I read into movies. It's what I do. And so I just read into it as like, well, it seemed like you only wanted to include that stuff to either a make silly, make vilify, or make people who cared about being cautious during the pandemic look obnoxious and idiotic.
So I'll agree and disagree with what you said there because one, I do believe that setting it during the COVID-19 pandemic made sense for this film because it was a very relevant thing that happened in our recent history, and ignoring it, a lot of, like, when you watch a lot of TV shows or movies, they just don't, they act like it never happened because a lot of people enjoy the escapism, right? Like, we don't want to go to the theater and just be reminded of what we've just lived through, right? Like, we're living through currently, like, in when it was really in the grips of the pandemic in 2020. So a lot of TV shows and movies just acted like it never happened. And then you get other shows like medical dramas who did address it, right? Because it was a serious. I mean, it's a serious pandemic. Millions of people died. So they did address it. So it's a weird balancing act. So I think addressing it and using it as a backdrop for this movie made sense, especially with the ending. When you say except for the ending, I say especially with the ending because when we get to that point, if you haven't seen it or you have seen it and you're waiting for us to get into spoilers, you'll know what we're talking about of why it was there. The other thing about, like, kind of almost mocking the situation a little bit when you talk about that, here I saw another movie recently, and God, I'm completely blanking on the title. I feel terrible not remembering the title. I'd watched it. I mentioned it to you. I was watching this new movie that I'd heard about, and it was oh God, what is it called? What is it called? The Harbinger. The
Oh,
Harbinger.
okay.
New movie called The Harbinger, and it also takes place in the pandemic. And it's about a woman who's having these really, really vivid nightmares, and it's almost like there's a creature stalking her dreams. People have said it's kind of like a Nightmare on Elm Street sort of film for for 2022 or 2023. And I watched it. And it wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad film. Um, but it also takes place during the pandemic, and they do a lot of the same things in that film in terms of people wearing masks and people kind of being mocked for wearing masks, and I don't think they're necessarily making a statement as much as reminding us of what it was like in that time. There were people who were very serious about it, who were wearing masks everywhere and spraying everything with Lysol and
Oh
wiping
yeah, sure.
why? And then there's the other people who would open their door and basically tell you to f off. If you asked them to put on a mask. There's like it was a huge, there was a big divide there.
The f off people were not represented in this movie. Interestingly enough.
But so in that regard, well, to call, where I disagree with you there about they weren't represented, I would say that the movie's so small it's harder for them to be represented because we're ultimately talking about maybe 10 people in this movie, so I don't think there was as much of an opportunity to do that. But neither here nor there. That movie did it as well, where it was a lot, and it was weird because that film really had nothing to do with the pandemic. It just said it during the pandemic, and these women who were friends in high school, I think, or college, and they got back together, and you know it was all about the one setting that had a point to that movie was the a brother and sister were living at home with their father, and their father was ill, and so they were paranoid about bringing home COVID because he was already ill, and they were terrified of, like, getting him sick and dying. And so that was like a backdrop of the movie, but it really played no part in the movie. Like, when it was over, I was kind of like, why did that need, like, were you just doing it because this was the time you filmed it? And so because of COVID protocols and everyone was being forced to wear masks anyways, or you were wearing masks on set, so you just decided to incorporate it because it really made no impact whatsoever on the film. It was just in there. It was weird too because it didn't. They had this one weird character who was like that, like, I'm not putting on a mask. Like, they had to, and I was just like, why is this here? Like, this made no point to this movie. Like, you could have said it any other time. This had no impact. Where I believe Sick works is because when you get to the overall plot of why this is happening, it actually does play into the plot, and I actually really enjoyed that plot device because it was a little different. It wasn't. It was something that used the pandemic towards the a means to an end when it came to the plot. Like in that way. Now, to be clear, Patrick, what you're saying is it didn't need to be COVID. You're right. It could have been,
Yeah, could have been
it
whatever.
could have been
It
another
seemed to
disease.
be explicitly addressing
But
COVID
it
19.
was.
Yeah.
But to that, but what I say when I say it is like, let's just say a disease, whether it's COVID or not. Like
Sure,
they
sure.
use that, and that's where I defend this movie. And also the other reason why I like this movie, where how they use COVID is this is not, just to put it out there, this isn't really a spoiler. It's a slasher, but it's not a supernatural slasher. So this isn't like some super COVID
Right.
monster or anything like that. Because there were other attempts to use the pandemic in films, and I mentioned that earlier in the intro, and most of them failed spectacularly because they tried to use it as almost like a fear inducing kind of thing. Not that you shouldn't be afraid of the pandemic, but almost taking it to that next level. Like there was a movie that came out, I think it was called Birdsong or something like this, where it was like the pandemic was really bad. Like it had killed, half the planet or whatever, something like that. And so it was like a story of that. And I think at that moment it was a bad idea because people were already paranoid. People were already scared out of their minds and losing loved ones, and people were sick, and they weren't thinking about getting worse, right? Like they weren't like, I don't want this to get any worse. So those films kind of failed. Um, this one, I I agree with what you're saying in principle about like maybe having a bit of an agenda, but it's not so in your face, in my opinion. It's not so in your face that you're going to walk out necessarily, in my opinion, feeling one way strongly there. Now, if you were hardcore about the pandemic, meaning you were all about, lysoling everything and masks,
Yeah.
you might feel one way. If you're on the other side where you're like, masks were stupid, we should have never been locked down, and blah blah blah, you might feel another way. So I think there's gonna be a certain set of feelings because this is so recent.
Oh
It,
yeah,
it's
it's
so
a
recent.
raw wound that's still open and weeping.
Yeah.
And I do think the ending, which we will get to shortly, I do think the ending is especially making a comment. I think it's like, look at the lengths that certain types of people will go to. In my opinion, now you can argue that our main character Parker, played by Gideon Adlin, you can argue she kind of fits into the other side of it. But I have some thoughts about that. Now that this slasher is like any proper slasher, like a proper Kevin Williamson slasher, is going to be set with a couple of college students, a couple of young people in their 20s or so. Well, people in their 20s or so were the like the number one group of people who weren't wearing masks, who were partying hard, who were like hanging out with everybody. Like actually that demographic, regardless of how you felt about the pandemic, that early 20s demo was just sort of like, I'll be fine. Like I'm young. I don't need to. I don't really need to wear a mask, and I don't necessarily need to take extra precautions. So I don't even think that part of it necessarily was like agenda driven. It's just like, yeah, if you're going to make any group of people right in the heart of the pandemic be slightly careless, as I think these college students were, you might as well make it, that age range. To me, that felt fine. But yeah, it did feel like the ending was sort of saying something about one side and not the other at all. Does it, by the way, does every movie need to be even handed? No, that's fine. If we're deciding to at least just pick a side for this and like, I think take jabs at them, which I do think it does, then this movie certainly does that. I don't even know if I necessarily agree with the jabs it takes. It's like I was like, oh, okay, it seems to be how Kevin Williamson feels about it. And I'm assuming he kind of spearheaded the whole thing. He's the biggest name on the entire project. The director's done a lot of TV stuff, but not really well known for features or anything like that.
Yeah, let me mention real quick. The director behind this movie is a guy named John Hyams, and I was not super familiar with him. He had actually done a couple of installments in the Universal Soldier line, which that's a classic Dolph Lundgren,
Oh
Jean
yeah,
Claude Van Damme movie. He did a couple installments of that, but the only movie I was familiar with him with was a documentary he did called The Smashing Machine.
yep,
The Life and Times of Mark Kerr, who is a very famous UFC fighter and a guy I've known, and it actually involved a very, very close friend of mine, Mark the Hammer Coleman, who's a very good, close personal friend of mine. And that documentary is incredible. I mean, it's an
yeah.
incredible documentary, incredibly powerful documentary. And when I looked him up, I was like, oh, wow, I didn't know he had directed that. So, yeah, that was the only other thing of his I'd really seen.
It's a Damon connection.
It was a great film. So I wasn't super familiar with him. Here's what I'll say. We're talking a lot about the COVID-19 stuff. We're talking a lot about the pandemic, how it does play a central role in this film, and it does. But let me be clear, because there's going to be a lot of people who might listen to this and say, listen, I just got through the pandemic. I don't want to preach about the pandemic anymore. And I get it, because as I said, there's a scene in this film where they go to that grocery store, and I was like, oh, this is like flashback,
Yeah.
what I don't want to remember. Um,
That was like kind of the most dreadful part of the movie, I think,
yeah.
because it was so real. I think that felt very genuine and just sort of straightforward. Like, oh God, we've lived through that. That's not fun.
Yeah, but I will say this: when you get basically when these characters Parker and Mary end up at this lake house, and they're trying to basically quarantine there to get away from the city and just kind of like be away from the world and deal with the start of the pandemic when everything's getting locked down. Once they get there, and the actual slashing, for lack of a better word, begins, the middle part of the movie, the 2/3 middle part of the movie, where you're really getting the action of the slashing and the stalker trying to kill these girls, um, it doesn't really involve the pandemic. It doesn't
Yeah.
involve. It's just it turns into a classic slasher, and I'm saying that as both. I'm saying that as a compliment to the movie because it takes you out of it. Like I feel like when you do deal with subject matter, whether you're talking about like you're talking about like social commentary or whatever, there are films that do it great, like Get Out, which is brilliant, one of the most brilliant films ever. And there's other films, and I'm not going to name drop here to make people feel bad, but there's other films where they do it, they bludgeon you over the head with it, and it just doesn't work. Or they do it to a point where it just loses its effectiveness because you won't do it in an intelligent way to actually make it a compelling story, right? What I liked about Sick was that it is central to the plot, and the movie opens that way and it kind of deals with it. But then when you get into like the action part of it, it's just nonstop tension and a cat and mouse game of survival, and you don't really think about it at that moment. And then it does pick up. We'll talk about that in the end. But that's what I enjoyed about it, meaning that if you don't feel one way about the other about the pandemic, or you're just tired of the pandemic, and I get it, we've lived through it for a couple of years, and it's not really over. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not,
I said we at least got another year and a half,
yeah,
probably
we're not
minimum.
over it. And you just don't want to think about it. I get it. Trust me. I understand escapism. I 100%. But this film to me doesn't do it in a way to where it just when it's over and it's uncomfortable, and I'm just like, God, I wish I hadn't watched that movie, like because there's just too much, whatever it is. Um, to me, that's how I took it. Like it uses it, it's a plot device, but it's not to the point where it's so in your face for the majority of the movie to where it ruins it, or you could just tell that there's just a message they're trying to get across, and they lose the point of the actual movie. The middle section of the movie, if you took the middle section of this movie and just made it about a slasher going after a couple teen girls. You don't need any of the other stuff in there, right? Like it's just a classic slasher film, and you can enjoy it for that. I guess is what I'm getting at. You don't have to really focus on the pandemic part of it until the beginning and the end. Now, again, the actual plot device of why this is happening does play back into that, but the middle section when it's just cat and mouse survival is really well done and feels like a classic Kevin Williamson. It feels very Scream. I Know What You Did Last Summer. It has that vibe to it, in my opinion.
I think we should open up the spoiler section now, just so I actually do want to talk about what you said, but I think it will get into something that we're dealing with in the actual like spoilerish side of the plot.
Yeah. Well, before we get there, was there anything you enjoyed about this movie? Because it seems like in terms of the movie itself, because I'll be honest, like again, before we get to spoilers, and for people who are maybe going to pause this and come back, and maybe after they watch it, I will say overall I really enjoyed this film. There was a lot of good tension, a lot of good action sets, which I really enjoy, which I think you need in a slasher. If you don't have that, you're kind of missing the point of being in a slasher film. And Kevin Williamson knows how to do that. I mean, maybe better than anybody out there right now, because he's the guy who created Scream and Scream 2. He created perfect slasher elements in this film. So for that, I really enjoyed it. And again, it was fun to return to a Kevin Williamson film. He hasn't really done one of these kinds of movies in a lot of years, and it was just fun to go back to. It's a very small movie. very very small cast, but I enjoyed it. So I'll ask you, was there anything you enjoyed about the movie, Patrick?
I will say that I think the director John Hyams, I think he actually did a really good job of making the action scenes, because it's kind of like, I mean, it's definitely a slasher, but it's, I guess, when in those moments where the subjects are dealing with the slasher, it's actually kind of good camera direction and stuff like that. Like, I will say that much. Like, I did enjoy that aspect of it.
Yeah, and I am a slasher fan. We all know this.
As am I.
This is my genre. So, all right. Let's get into spoilers. We'll get into categories. We'll get into spoilers now. So if you haven't seen Sick, it's currently available over on Peacock. Again, you get my recommendation in terms of watching it and checking it out. It's a very short movie too. It's only about an hour and 23 minutes. It's not a long film at all. It's a very short movie. So you're not going to have to invest like 3 hours to watch this thing. Very short movie. And again, very small cast, a total of maybe like 7 or 8 characters in this whole thing, maybe 9. Very small movie. So again, go check it out. It's on Peacock. So as of right now, we're going to get into spoilers. We're going to talk about spoilers. We're going to get into our categories as well. So with that being said, Patrick, what is your thought on the spoiler section you want to talk about here?
Well, it's to your point about slashers. Now, we both love slashers. This movie is really boiled down. Now, it's boiled down for, I think, a lot of different reasons. A, like they said it during the pandemic. B, that's a great device to just isolate people and make a contained horror thriller. If you're gonna have a slasher, I think an entertaining slasher, in my opinion, it needs one thing or the other. So if your slasher is going to be super boiled down and simplistic, then the kills, the killer, or the characters need to be very interesting. One of those three elements has to really work. Scream does it great. Scream does it great on 2 fronts. 3 fronts, really. It does it all 3. And Kevin Williamson wrote this. Great character development, tons of it. Interesting killer. Ghostface is interesting. Interesting kills. Now, I could argue that Scream doesn't have the most interesting kills out of all the slashers. It's not like the ones with it's not like Jason or Freddy where the kills are kind of why you're there and why you show up. You're really more there for the character development. So we don't have, in my opinion, Sick doesn't have any of those 3 things. It doesn't have interesting kills. The killers are very uninteresting, like intensely uninteresting. And the people, you barely get to know them, which is very un-Kevin Williamson. Like, his track record is sort of like the emotional, angsty teens and 20-year-olds of the early 2000s. Like, that was his strength. I was surprised to see how very surface level our main characters were. Miri and Parker. Parker, who's our lead, Gideon Adlin, like, it gave me shades of Hellraiser. Where I mean, I remember we both felt about the Hellraiser remake, like about an hour in, you go, I don't know why I'm on the trip with this person. And I argue that Hellraiser character had way more development than Parker did. Parker was very surface level. Now you could say, well, okay, she's a vapid college student. Okay, but give me some depth, give me something to grab onto. So ultimately, this didn't work for me as a slasher because it didn't tick off any of those boxes. I'm curious, do you think it ticked off any of those boxes? Because I couldn't, for the love of me, find interesting person, interesting kill, or interesting killer.
I would disagree on 2 of those points.
Okay.
Interesting kills, I would disagree on because there was some creativity here in terms of the way the cat and mouse game was working. And there were some fun chase scenes in there that worked really, really well. And there was some good tension in there. There's some, again, when you're talking about an isolated situation where 2 girls are in a lake house by themselves and they're being hunted, there were a couple of good, interesting moments. There's a really great moment where the one girl, Mary, falls off the roof and literally, it seems like she broke her back in the moment. Like, she falls and you think she's dead. She's not actually dead.
Yeah, and like I said, the action, I think, was pretty good.
And they're dealing with what ultimately ends up being a compound fracture. Her bone comes through her leg, which is rather gross, which is an injury I've seen up close and personal in real life. It's not fun.
No.
So that one was good. I also there was a great moment, in the film where they use a electric knife to slice an Achilles tendon, which is a rather gruesome, kind of a cool, interesting
Okay.
way to do it. So so when I say interesting kills, I mean that everything in this film is boiled down
Oh
in
yeah.
in a simplistic way, and that's why. See, you brought up Hellraiser is a great point. We talked about Hellraiser, like these characters we just didn't care about them. They did nothing to make us care about them. Here's the problem with when I compare those two. I agree with you 100%. But Hellraiser was all driven around like these couple of central characters where they were just like pushing them in your face for 2 hours, trying to make it seem like they mattered, and we could never figure out why they mattered. This film, in my opinion, doesn't really do that and doesn't need that because, as weird as this sounds, the lead characters are kind of coincidental to the larger plot of what gets unraveled at the end when you find out what they did. And the whole point of, like you talk about, they're just vapid college students who don't really, realize the consequences of their actions. That's kind of the point. And that's where the whole character development thing, when you're spending time with them early in the film, they're out by the lake and they're talking about their boyfriends and parties, and that sounds like every college student I knew in my freshman year of college. And then by sophomore and junior year, we all started to grow up a little bit. We all started to realize, hey, you can't fuck around and party 5 nights a week. You actually need to study and do, And so by the time you get to like your junior year of college, you're kind of like, settled down a little bit. You're not in the full on party mode and being an idiot anymore. I very much got freshman year vibes from these two girls where
I'm
there's just
sure Parker's a freshman.
all surface level. And that's not an insult to Kevin Williamson's writing. I'm saying this as a guy who was in college, and I know you went to college as well. It felt like so many people I knew in college. And I guess that's kind of where I related to it because I was like, oh my God, I went to college with people exactly like this who were all surface level. They were as deep as a mud puddle. And and while that sounds terrible, and you're like, and I agree with you in general, I agree with you in principle that the character development's a huge part of it. In this case, I think the character development was making them kind of vapid, almost what the word am I looking for? Like almost like clueless. There's a good clueless teenagers, for lack of a better word. You know what I mean? I think in that regard, that's what he was going for. And it worked because they were. And again, that's what I felt they were. I didn't think he was trying, because sometimes I feel like the one complaint I have sometimes about slashers or horror films is when they go overboard on the character development and they try to make their lead characters more than what they are. And you can tell they're feeding them words and making them sound smarter than what they are. They add too much. There's a weird balancing act with character development where you can go too far, you can go not enough. This one, I would agree, there's not a lot of character development, but at the same time, I don't really think it's necessary because I think when you get to the ending and you realize why these girls are being stalked or why one girl in particular is being stalked, it's because she was a vapid, clueless teenager who didn't take responsibility for her actions.
Yeah, but it just wasn't interesting. That's the problem. Is that yes, that's like logically like the through line makes total sense. I mean, Kevin Williamson, veteran writer, so that makes sense. But it wasn't interesting at all. In my opinion, like her story was like very, very uninteresting, and I didn't really care if she lived or died, which is kind of a cardinal sin in a slasher. You either really want the person to die or you really want them to live. I felt neither way about her. I really didn't care, and that's to me the biggest sin of the movie. Here's a great example. It was what was that movie that just came out in December? Christmas, Bloody Christmas.
Yeah,
The one with the Robo Santa.
yeah, Bloody Christmas. I think I can't remember.
Yeah. So in that movie, pretty much like I want to say, oh gosh, 80, no, not 80, maybe 80, maybe 70 of the 90 minutes of that movie are vapid record store conversations. You don't learn dick about those characters. You don't care about those characters. There's very little that goes on in that movie that you give a shit about. So what do? They made the kills fucking awesome. Like the kills were so cool that like me and my wife watching, we were sort of getting a little bored because I think the first like 40 minutes of that movie is just people talking shit and getting drunk. And you're like, God, that's fucking boring. But when the kills happen, you go, whoa, like big, like kills that, in my opinion, the kills in Sick do not compare like that. They're kills I've seen in other slashers, and most of them are sort of tame in that respect. Like there's one great kill in the whole movie, and I still chalk it up to the direction, not necessarily the acting, or the writing, or the character development, or any of that. So that's kind of where I landed with it. I was like, well, shit, okay, and I think it sounds like you disagree with me on the character development. Okay, that's fine, but we both agree the killers are not interesting. They don't even look interesting. And I put a note down at one point. One of them walks through the door, and they're clearly very small. And I was like, now I see why Damon had a problem with Jackie Earle Haley as Freddy Krueger, because that guy he doesn't look like he's going to scare anybody. But he's also in uninteresting garb. He's just in some black garb, and there's nothing that stands out about that killer as interesting. So that's why this movie ultimately falls flat for me. Some people are going to love it, and some people are going to go, hey, that's a classic, like right down the middle slasher. It's a little too down the middle for me.
Here and again, this is in terms of opinion, and obviously this is one where a lot of times we agree. This is one where we disagree. I think that this is a film. Well, I agree with you on the killers. They were not the killers didn't become interesting until you understood what they were doing, and that's the only moment they became slightly interesting because you understood their motivations, and that doesn't come until the last 20 minutes of the movie.
Right.
Up till then, they're not very interesting. I'll give you that. Where I like this movie and where I compliment this movie is it is a very simple slasher. It is, it is not the most complicated plot. It is not the most overdeveloped characters. And when I talk about like at the end of 2023 and I talk about my favorite films of the year, I have a hard time believing this is going to be on there because it's such a very simple, easy. It's a paint by numbers in a lot of ways slasher film, and people are going to go, well, that sounds boring. It's not because they do it right, because there's 1,000 versions of this movie where it's boring, doesn't get the point across, and it lasts for 2 hours. And I'm not going to name names. We've talked about them on this show. We've talked about them between us and text messages, movies we watch. We're like, I know what they were trying to go for, but boy, did they take a long freaking time to get there, and it was really boring journey to get there. This film is 80 minutes, 83 minutes. It's a very quick, easy watch. It sticks to the point of what you're trying to do, and the middle section of the movie, 60 minutes of the movie, is basically a cat and mouse game of killer going after girls. And when you boil it down to that, and at that point, while to your point, if the kills had been more creative and they've been a little bit more upstaged, so to speak, this would have basically been, and I I know you're going to laugh when I say this, this would have been a Friday the 13th movie, because that's what every Friday
Yeah, no, 100%.
There's no
But that's why I like Friday. Well, Friday the 13th has two things. It has a very interesting killer. Jason's super interesting.
Right.
And then the interesting kills. The characters are as vapid as it gets.
Yeah, so if you take the interesting killer out of there, you still have the interesting kills. I get where you're going with it. I understand what you're saying. But when they boil it down to the basics of the cat and mouse game and a couple of really cool, there were a couple of cool, brutal moments we'll talk about with kills and gore that I enjoyed. But it's just it's a very simple, old school slasher film that doesn't go too far. And could they have ratcheted this up in terms of better character development, maybe a little bit more interesting killers? Yes, but again, the reason I compliment this film is because they do keep it basic, they do keep it simple, and what they do simply works. They don't go too far. Now, are there improvements that I could say, yeah, they should have done this, or I wish they had done this, or as you said, maybe make the killers a little bit more menacing, or make them a little bit more than just,
or start their story a little sooner. Like give it more meat,
Or they're just walking around with black hooded shirts on and a mask on, and they're like, at least like with Scream, you had the mask killer ghost. Yes, I agree that you could have done all that, but at the end, like when this film was over and it was done, my girlfriend and I watched it. We both looked at each other and we're like, that was fun. Like, it was fun. It's not gonna, I'll warn you ahead of time, it's not the kind of movie you're gonna call your friends and say, oh my God, my life is transformed because I watched Sick. And it's not the kind of message in a movie where you're going to be like, oh, this is the new Get Out. It's none of those things. It's just a fun, goofy slasher film. And as a slasher fan, it's kind of like, X came out last year. Now X was infinitely a better film overall.
Oh yeah,
I'll
very,
say
yeah,
that.
big more.
But when X came out and it was just that, it was just a slasher. It was a good slasher film. Again, far more developed. I'm not trying to compare the two. But
Mhm.
as a guy who loves slashers and I get irritated by the amount of the elevated horror that comes out, and people are like, "Oh my god, Midsommar is so good."
You gotta put Midsommar on the shelf. That movie's getting old.
Um, when I
You
hear
can
that,
you can call it the new Men. You
yeah,
can go with
I
Men
just
now.
sometimes I need a fun, simple slasher, and that's what this was, and that's really what it boiled down to me. I didn't need, could it have been more? Absolutely, absolutely could have been more. But for what it was good enough. And again, this isn't. I'm not saying this is a 5 out of 5 star movie, and it's #1 on the film for the year, and all. I'm not going that far. It's just a fun, easy watch, and sometimes I just want a fun, easy watch. You know what I watched over the weekend? Beyond sick, I watched like 4 of the Friday the 13th movies because they were doing the marathon for Friday the 13th on Friday. And they were on Stars or whatever, and I watched like 4 of them, and a couple of them I hadn't seen in years. Now I watched part 4, which we had reviewed on the show,
Great movie.
and I watched part 4, 5, 6, and 7 in a row. And I've said on the show, Friday the 13th's never been ultimately been my jam. I am more about story. I am more about character development, which kind of is the opposite of what I'm saying about this film. But watching it, I was kind of like, you know what? These are kind of fun. Like they're fun. Like I don't need them
Yeah.
to necessarily be more than that. I mean, they're fun, and there's some pretty cool kills, and that's. I know I'm not comparing it to Friday the 13th, even though I kind of am. But I'm just saying it's just a fun, goofy slasher film. Um, and I enjoyed it, and that's really what it boils down to for me. It's not it's not going to be my favorite movie of the year. It's not going to be a movie that I'm going to revisit every weekend and be like, oh man, I'm not going to show my friends, but you've got to watch this one. But if you're looking for, there's been so many attempts at movies like this that have failed. Like another one
Oh
that came
yeah,
out
plenty of.
last year was a movie that came out called They Them on Peacock, which had Kevin Bacon in it. And if you remember, I
Oh,
messaged
I
you
watched
about
it,
it.
and you didn't
Yeah,
like it, and I didn't care for it myself.
hated it. I didn't just dislike. I hated it. I hated that movie. It was so bad. And they tried to insert the message. They tried to insert characters you care about. They tried to insert kills. None of it worked. Nothing in that movie
But
worked.
at least they tried. I'm so sorry.
But that's
Sick
what
doesn't try very hard.
it
Like
tries.
They Them is not a good movie. I
It
agree,
tries
but it
because
tried really
it
hard.
tries because it boils it down to the simplest form of what makes a slasher film, which is a cat and mouse game of survival. That's what this film is.
I'm gonna put on a poster some keywords that you said there for Kevin Williamson's Sick. Simple, basic, good enough. Damon Martin. It's just that's all it is. It's simple. It's basic. It's good. Good enough is not necessarily a ringing endorsement.
It's a ringing endorsement for the just utter nonsense of what slasher films have become, or attempts to make slasher films.
I think we've had
outside
a
of
lot of good slashers lately, though.
outside of a couple of good ones, and there have been a
Yeah.
couple of good ones. But
But
again,
I guess I see if I can clarify what you're trying to get at here though. Are
sure.
you talking about the kind of slashers that like almost always go straight to streaming and no one talks about? Because I don't think I would put Kevin Williamson in those categories of
No, no,
like
no, no,
what
no.
we used to call straight to video.
No. I wouldn't go that far. I would this. I'm comparing this to the early '80s days of when there was a new slasher film in theaters. When you had The Prowler hit theaters, you had Happy Birthday to Me hit theaters. You had movies like that every other weekend. There was a slasher film. I would put it in that regard, not necessarily, but in the new version, like there are new era slashers or attempts at slashers that come out that just aren't well done, and they try to overthink it. And this is a film that doesn't overthink itself.
It sure don't.
You argue it's to his detriment. I argue that it works because I don't need
Yeah.
it to overthink itself. Because again, this is ultimately a cat and mouse game of survival, and in those moments, there are harrowing moments. There's good tension, good chase scenes, and again, this is to me no different than a Friday the 13th film, with the exception of Jason isn't here. And I know,
And the uninteresting kills.
but the kills to me again, I disagree. I don't think the kills were that uninteresting. I thought they were solid enough. There were some.
I thought we should get into the categories because I do have one that I think is a really good one.
All right. Well, with that being said, let's get into the categories. And let's talk about best performance, because again, this is a very small cast, and actually, when you dig into it, there's actually a couple of well-known actors in here that I was like, oh wow, they're in this movie.
Yeah.
Who did you give best performance to?
My best performance goes to Jane Addams, who plays Pamela. She's one of the killers. Turns out the killers are a family, a mother, a father, and a younger brother of a guy who died at the hands, very careless hands of Parker. She was asymptomatic with COVID. She was at a party, a bunch of college students going to party. She's, flirting, hanging out, kissing a bunch of dudes. One of the dudes she kissed, she gave COVID and he died. And the family came after her. She's one of these serial posters online. They tracked her down via her social media. All the pieces fit. I would never accuse this movie of like having logical issues because it doesn't. Kevin Williamson very good at that stuff, and it shows in the simplicity actually of his writing. But Jane Addams to me was the best performer in the bunch. She's a veteran of TV and film. You've seen her in a lot of different things, and you see her right there in the trailer. She has a great little moment in the trailer that I thought really rang very genuine. Parker is trying to run from the killers, and she's banging on the window, and Pamela's in the car, and she's like, "Where's your mask? Put your mask on." But the way Jane Addams like delivers that really, outside of the grocery store scene, really brought me back to the early days of the pandemic when people would freak out if you got too near them without a mask on. I was like, yeah, Jane Addams knows how to sell it.
Yeah, she was really good, and she actually had a really strong performance at two levels, because when you first are introduced to her, you think she's just a passerby, and she's kind of like at that paranoid, pandemic era of like, "Where's your mask? You can't get in the car without your mask." And like, here's this girl who's being chased by a masked killer, and she's like, "Let me in, lady." And she's like, "No, you could be infected." And like in that moment, you're taking, as you said, take it back to the pandemic, where you're like, "Really? I'm about to get stabbed to death here, but you're worried about that?" So that was a good one. And then, of course, when you actually discover that she's actually one of the killers, it kind of a good transformation of that character. It's funny you say that, because my best performance actually goes to the other side of that, which is the other killer played by her husband, which is Mark Menchaca, who plays her husband. Mark Menchaca is one of my favorite character actors out there. He was in a show called Ozark. In the first season of Ozark. Incredible. Actually, he just recently popped in the news again. I'll say congratulations, because I know he's a regular listener of this podcast.
Hi, Mark.
He just recently married Lena Headey, who, of course, is Cersei from Game of Thrones. They got married.
Cool. That's just cool as fucking ice.
Yeah. He's a really good character actor. Actually, a really good singer, too. He actually is a...
Oh, no shit.
Yeah, he plays acoustic guitar. Really good singer. But I really enjoyed him in this role. He's good, menacing, and what I liked about his performance was when you actually discover the plot of how these parents were basically contact tracing. That was such a huge part of the early part of the pandemic, right? Like, there was actually, I remember when I was getting ready to travel for the first time, there was an app that you could log into, and it would notify you if, like, let's say I went to the bookstore. I went to Barnes and Nobles, and I was there at 2:00 on Tuesday. There was an app that someone had created that if you left there and someone else from there had tested positive for COVID and reported it, it would notify you to say you were in a location where 5 people just tested positive, and it would give you an idea that you may be positive for COVID. Like, it was contact. It was a weirdly intrusive, but like understanding. People were trying to like deal with the contact tracing thing. And when they talked about it, like, they discovered through, and she brought up earlier, you mentioned, like, it all makes sense. All the puzzle pieces come together. But the way he describes it and saying, like, the way that she was so flippant with her kissing guys at this party and not really caring and whatever, and because she brings it up so many times in the film, Parker says, "I'm not sick. You're asymptomatic." And the way that he switches is like a menacing killer to just an enraged father really made sense in that role, and I thought he did a really, really good job. And again, he's not in the film for a lot. He's in the last like 20 minutes. But I thought he did a really good job of playing it, because I don't have kids. You do. But I can only imagine the lengths you would go to avenge your child under whatever circumstances. And this guy had that, like, I'm a dad, but I want revenge, and he kind of had that like little bit of crazy in his eyes, and I enjoyed that
Yeah.
about his performance.
I totally related to Mark Menchaca's character because I think if anybody does anything to my boys, like I am going full slasher on them.
Yeah.
Like there's no question about it. Like, and I have a deep pool to to dive in and pull from. You know what I mean? Like I got a lot of interesting kills stored in the database. So don't fuck with me. All right.
But to that point, we talk about the simplicity movie. What I again using the pandemic, they actually used it in a way that worked out in the
That's
end.
the best part. I think that's actually the most clever use of the pandemic in the entire thing.
Yeah, their son died because he made out with a girl at a party, a girl who was positive for COVID. She didn't think anything of it, and he ended up dying. And
Mm-hmm.
that was and that I was like when they revealed that, I was like, oh damn, that was clever. Like that was a clever twist in the plot of this movie, because up to that point you're just seeing girls getting chased across a lake house by a couple of masked killers. You don't know why. Like you have no idea
Mm-hmm.
why. And there's an opening scene in this film where the guy at the grocery store goes back to his dorm room or his dorm apartment, whatever you want to call it, and he ends up getting killed. You have no idea why he gets killed. You find out at the end that he was the guy who they believe had COVID, passed it to Parker, and then Parker passed it to their son. And they
Mm-hmm.
did all this. And also, the brilliance that I enjoyed about this film, the one thing I really enjoyed about this film was they used social media to track all these people down, because people post their entire lives
Oh
on
yeah.
social media without regard of like the I don't say the harm. I'm just saying like without the recourse that could come from that. So that's all they did. They tracked the guy that she made out with that had COVID. Then she tracked her to their son, and that's how they got like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon to their son's killer. And that's who they killed in the movie.
You throw Kevin Bacon in this movie, now you have my attention.
Well, they did that with they them, and that didn't work.
That's why I watched They Them. Okay, listen. But they tried.
They
They
did.
tried.
They did. Let's talk about best gore, because again, this is a slasher film. There is some gore. So, what was the best gore in this film?
I had to give it to, and there's actually a couple of moments that are worth talking about. But I love a good throat slash, and it's very classic slasher. Listen, you and I grew up on watching people get their throats slashed. It's a very, I have a feeling like if we saw someone get their throat slashed in person, we'd be like, yeah, yeah, I've seen that before. Like we've just seen it so many damn times at this point in our lives that it doesn't affect us the way it is. So the way it should. So I appreciate it. I think it was a good look. I think it was that first guy. I can't remember his name.
Your first guy name.
Yeah, the first guy they tracked down. There's a great turn to camera. Again, the direction I thought in this movie was the highlight of the movie. But he turns just to camera, and they pull the knife across his throat, and it opens up, and the blood comes out. Very classic slasher, but with modern technology, it looked clean as hell. I was like, that's a really solid looking throat slash for a movie that's a little light on gore.
It was also an effective enough scare, because it was very classic Kevin Williamson opening with a kill, right? Like very Scream-esque with a character getting killed in the beginning. And what I enjoyed about it is that it came back around as to why. Like, you know what I mean? Like it wasn't.
Yeah, it all mattered.
Yeah, it all mattered. And also, the one thing I like about this, when you talk about the killers weren't that interesting. I would agree in regards to that part. But what I did like, and this was the realism of that, kind of like what they did with Scream, is they did make these people seem superhuman. You know what I mean? Like the killers got beat up at points. Like, you know what I mean? They're not
It felt like Scream a lot.
and then when you discover it's a mom and dad and a son, like they're not these like supernatural, they're not like some, they're not a family of bodybuilders or anything. They're just three normal people looking for a. So
You just gave me an idea for a horror film.
I kind of enjoyed that, because sometimes that's again me pointing out the fault of bad slasher movies. Is sometimes they make these people like. I'm not going on the supernatural tip, but they just make them seem like they can't be hurt, and it's like you get hit with a glass vase or something, you're gonna get hurt, and they actually played that for real in this movie. I enjoyed that. For me, the best gore, and I was almost gonna go best kill for this one as well, because it was my favorite, but technically it wasn't a kill. My best gore was in a moment when Parker gets an upper hand on one of the killers, which at the moment we don't know there's multiple killers. We only see one at certain moments. We later find out there's three. But in the moment, she gets the upper hand on one of the killers, who ends up being the other son of this couple. And she grabs what I think is like a coffee pot or a mixer. I can't really tell what, or
Yeah, like a big mixing bowl or some shit.
some sort of kitchen appliance. And she just smashes the shit out of this dude's head and turns his face into mush. And when they pan down, just like, ugh. Now, the problem is that he actually didn't die. He lived and then died a few seconds later when the other girl, Miri, ends up stabbing him in the neck. It's kind of a cool little just like pinprick, and he dies from that. I was kind of like, how's this dude survive? Just turn his face into mush. But the gore was pretty cool because what I enjoyed about that moment was generally in these kind of slashers, the character will hit the other person like one time. Oh, it's
Yeah.
over. No. Parker smashed the shit out of this dude's face with like 30 smashes of this kitchen appliance. I enjoyed that because in the moment that should be more real because one hit ain't gonna do the job. I enjoyed that she just completely turned his face. It looked like she just stepped on a tomato, is what it looked like.
That's very, like a tomato with googly eyes. Like it looked like she just smashed on one of those. Yeah, I mean it had a couple of moments. The compound fracture you talked about. That's always a good one. It's not like something about that. And we talked about throat slashing. Like just seeing a broken leg gets me more than most things.
Well,
Like just a proper broken leg is like, eh.
Well, that's what I said earlier. Like, it wasn't necessarily good gore, and it wasn't necessarily a kill, but the moment when she uses the electric knife to slice the Achilles tendon, and you see the blood kind of spray out, but like, there's something so like you talk about compound fractures. People, it's happened in other movies too, where they slash the Achilles.
Oh yeah, it's a good. It's always a good one.
Every time it happens, it makes me cringe because I know how bad, like you know how bad it hurts when you like cut the back of your ankle, and oh my god, when they do that with the electric knife, like with the carving knife, like what you use for a turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's a good, but again, it's not a kill, and there's really not great gore, but it's a good effective moment in the film.
Effective enough.
Let's talk about best kill. What was the best kill in Sick?
My best kill came when Parker and Miri kill the dad who's coming after them. But again, it comes down to the director again. What's his name? John Hyams. It comes down to John Hyams' direction because this is a very action-heavy movie in those moments, in the moments where they're struggling with the killers, and it's just a great shot. It's a really great shot. They're up on the second story and they're fighting with him, and they're trying to beat him, and they push him over the edge of the railing, and he goes flipping down, and he lands on the antlers. Very very Lost Boys ending, very David's ending of Lost Boys in that respect. But it was just cleverly shot. Like I think that's what I appreciate about it. It wasn't like the greatest kill. It was the execution from the camera team. So like I was shout out to the cinematographer and his camera crew for pulling that one off. I know that was a hard shot to get, and it looked great.
What I enjoyed about that shot also was because you bring this up a lot when we talk about plot devices. When you introduce something in the film, you better go back and use it, right? Like if you show us something weird in your house and you're like, oh, look at what my dad has, you better use that thing. And early in the film, you see this giant moose head or deer head or whatever it is, the mounted head, and then later in the film, DJ, the one guy, the other character we really haven't talked about, who comes to try to convince Parker to be her boyfriend. He's kind of like he's been shoved right deep into the friend zone, and he shows up there and tries to like convince her that he's like the perfect guy to be a boyfriend. When he's running from the slasher, he throws the deer head, like he tries to throw off the killer by putting obstacles in his way. And they come back, and that's how the deer head ended up on the ground. And so they use that plot device. So I enjoyed that. I remembered you in that moment, Patrick, where you say if you introduce something, you better damn well come back to it. And they did. They used that as a plot device. He tried to throw it, didn't work, but then it was laying on the ground face up, and then the dad fell onto it, and the horns impaled him.
Yeah, just a great one moment. One of the top moments of the movie for sure. Where I was like, okay, I like that.
Yeah, so that was good. My favorite, I don't know what. Apparently I need to see a psychiatrist or something. But
yes, you do.
One of my favorite. It's both favorite and least favorite kills in any movie. I don't have a lot of fears in terms of like like I'm not afraid of spiders. I'm not afraid of heights, things like that. But one thing that's always terrified me, because I know how horrific it would be, and I'm not making light of this. I'm being dead serious. One of the things that's always horrified me is the idea of being burned alive. Because
Oh yeah, not
like
fun.
that terrifies me. Like that, I think of a million ways you could die. That's the one I'd be like, that's the one I will never sign up for. Like that's the one that would, that's too much. But I have a weird fascination with people being burned alive in movies. I can't explain. Like I said, this is when I got to the end of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, when Rick Dalton grabs a flamethrower and torches the character from the Manson family in the pool. Awesome. And then that same girl, what's her name?
Oh gosh, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, she ends up getting set on fire in Scream 5. Also,
That's right. Yeah,
she has a
her
really
thing
bad,
is she gets set on fire.
she has a bad track record with fire. The end of the movie, the mother who survives till the very end, they end up setting her on fire with gas, and she runs out in the street and dies in front of the cops who finally show up to rescue the day. I just like that kill. It's a very classic kill, but man, being burned alive is the one I'm terrified of it. But it's a really effective kill when they do it right, and I thought they did it well in that moment because again, the mother wasn't dead. She comes back for one last good scare. As Kevin Williamson has always warned you, they always come back for one more scare. She did. She got set on fire for her trouble.
The setup for that fire walk was a little clunky, but it was a good fire walk, and I couldn't quite tell. I didn't go back and look at it again. It looked like it might have been CG, but if it was really well done. Because it's like a reverse tracking shot of following her as she's running down the middle of the road on fire, and then eventually collapses. And if you know anything about fire stunts, the fire stunt is over when the person falls over, and you'll almost see they almost always leave it in the movie. Like you see the moment where the stunt person falls over, that's their signal to say, "Put me out. It's time to put the fire out. I've been on fire long enough." And then the guys rush in and they extinguish them. This one, when whoever's doing the stunt, or if it's CG, they fall over and they stay there for at least a couple of moments, which I know by that point your fire extinguisher would have come in. Kevin Williamson and company are very familiar with slashers. Maybe they were like, let's pull this one off where they lay there for a second more, because we always cut away the minute they fall. So I thought that part of it was really cool.
Yeah, I enjoy, and also to your point, if it was CGI, it was great because
it was well done. If it was
CGI fire is probably one of the hardest things to do right, because I've seen really bad CGI fire in really high level productions. I don't know what it is about fire and CGI. It's just hard to do right. If they did it in this film, they did it really well. Although in my gut, I gotta believe it's practical effects, because this is I don't think this is a big budget movie or anything. If they did effects, I would be shocked, because it did look good. Like it looked legitimate. And generally when I see that, I'm like, they had to have a stunt performer do that, because
for sure,
bad CGI fire looks so bad.
It does. It's not. You don't want your bad CGI fire, guaranteed. But
if you have
I enjoyed it.
If you have a small budget and you can't afford good CGI fire, just don't do it.
Just don't do it. Don't. Just leave fire out. Rewrite.
Yeah. Let's talk about a bit of a rewrite of Living Dead, and not necessarily with this film. But you and I have been self-admitted slasher fans. That's the genre that got both of us into horror films. You with Friday the 13th, me with Nightmare on Elm Street, but then broadened our horizons, whether we're talking about Halloween or we're talking about My Bloody Valentine or any of the other dozens of horror films out there that are slasher films that you and I love. I thought X last year did a really, really solid job of reinventing the slasher. But Patrick, how do we reinvent the slasher for 2023? What are we missing here to create a good slasher for this era?
Well, I almost want to approach it from a different angle, where as opposed to what should be done, I want to point out what I think is being done right out there. One is we're creating new iconic killers. Sick doesn't do that, but Terrifier does it. Megan did it. These are new slashers. These are new takes. You got to be enamored with the killer, which is absolutely nothing new, by the way. And if anything, it's sort of like the Kevin Williamson era of slashers. might have been the only era where I was like, yeah, I don't. Outside of Ghostface, which is an idea more than an actual killer. Outside of Ghostface, the Kevin Williamson era, like I don't find the killers from those movies like terribly memorable. That most of them. So I see that we're moving in the right direction with reinventing slashers by reminding ourselves that it does take a charismatic killer in one way, shape, or form to make a slasher interesting. That's why we want to come back to it. Like, I don't care about a Sick 2. Sick 2 is not going to really excite me. Nobody in there interested me that much. But I think, and that's kind of where I see things are going in the right direction, which is we're actually taking a page out of the past and making sure that our killers are interesting. That keeps people on the hook for multiple movies. Another thing I think we got to do is I think we do need to retire one element of slashers, and we've actually been talking about this lately, and that is illogical main characters. Main characters who make really bad choices. Now, it is a staple of horror to make a bad choice. That's true. But it's and I can forgive small bad choices. I even think this movie makes a couple of big bad choices. That's my opinion. But I digress. You make a couple of small bad choices because that's what gets us in. But once we make the small bad choices, make all the good choices you can, and then bump up against the fact that all your good choices didn't matter. All the good choices you made still didn't matter, and the killer is still a step ahead of you. That makes it scary. So we got an interesting killer, and we got a smart protagonist that does all the right things and is still one step behind the killer the whole time. I think that's how you keep slashers fresh.
I agree for the most part. I definitely agree with the interesting killer part, especially if you're looking for a franchise, because that's the staple of slasher is a franchise, right? Like
Oh
Sick
yeah.
is not going to be a franchise. Like I agree with you. Like if they made a sequel, I would know the plot. It would be pointless, and I don't think this is a film you can sequelize, to be honest. And maybe they try it and it probably won't work. But for what it is for a single movie, it works. I just don't think you can redo it. I agree though with the interesting killer part. When you talk about Megan, you talk about Art the Clown from Terrifier. They made new iconic slashers that are part of a franchise, and I agree that is a staple. And they did it, with Victor Crowley and the Hatchet series. They've done it with other films, and there are versions of that, and it can be done. And I agree, that's a great way to do it. And in a way, they did that in X with Pearl. Like Pearl was in
Yeah.
X, and then she had her prequel in Pearl. We don't know what's going to be going on with Maxine, the sequel to that film, and how they're going to tie that back into the other films outside of Mia Goth's character. But they've created a world, and that's I think to a larger point when you talk about interesting killer, I think it's creating an interesting world, right, where that all exists. And if you're going to do sequels and things like that, so I
Like
agree.
a Scream is kind of like that because it's not the same killer every time. It is a different killer.
When you talk about smart choices, I think there's a balancing act. And what I say by that is this: I think Scream is a great example of characters making a lot of smart choices and then making a couple of dumb ones that get them caught up in bad situations. But I enjoy that because what Scream did better and really introduced when it came out was the idea that our characters are horror movie fans. Like Randy in Scream knows. Don't ever say I'll be back because you won't be back. That whole thing. Like they introduced that kind of meta world in the slasher, and throughout all those movies, every character in those movies, there's certain characters who feel like they should be ahead of the killer, right? Yet the killer stays one step ahead of them. I enjoy that. I really do enjoy that. When you talk about bad choices, though, because bad choices are a staple of horror movies, when you do that, it's frustrating, but it can also create a really interesting movie. And I know 110% the movie you're thinking about with bad choices is Barbarian.
Oh, I mean, it's the king of bad choices.
Um, but I think in a way, like because bad choices are, it's like that commercial I brought up on the show before, that Geico commercial with the
Mm-hmm.
teenagers running from the thing, and they're like, we should go in there. No, why don't we just stay behind the wall of chainsaws? And then someone says, why don't we just go to the running car? And the girl goes, are you crazy? Like That's the staple of slashers, right? Like they make the worst decisions. They say it in Scream. The girl's running up the stairs instead of running out the front door. But when the killer actually comes to chase Sidney Prescott, what does she do? She runs upstairs. It's instinctual, right? Like it's just you're in the moment. So I appreciate that they tackle that. So I agree with you in the right choice. I think you've got to be careful though in certain slashers. You can't make your characters too smart or you'll wonder why they didn't outsmart the killer. So I think there's a balancing act with that.
And that's why I say, like, they can make small bad choices, but not the big ones. I don't think the big ones are working anymore, in my opinion. I don't think making the big bad choices where it's like, wow, that just makes no sense, especially in a modern set slasher. Some of those choices they look outdated. It just doesn't look. It's like it doesn't make sense. So that's why I'm like, oh, okay, we can kind of get rid of that. Now with Scream, the great thing about Scream, and it kind of always has done this, is that you know that the killer is someone close to the protagonist, close enough. So you know that's how they're one step ahead.
Yeah.
So I think that's very exclusive to Scream. But I think if we get into smarter protagonists that do make one, all you need is one dumb choice. Like, here's a great example. Speak No Evil. Speak No Evil, the dumb choice was to go back for the teddy bear. They should have never gone back for the teddy bear. By the way, the teddy bear wasn't even in the house. It was under the seat in the car.
Yeah.
But they just made one dumb choice. It made sense why they did it. They go, well, it's our daughter's only, it's a very special teddy bear that she's always wanted. If they would have just let it be, because they knew something was wrong. But that's not the kind of people they were. They were good, polite, good-hearted people. So they went back for the teddy bear. That was their one big mistake. And I go, okay, that makes sense. But if you have like categorically idiotic moves by otherwise seemingly smart characters, it's not gonna work on a long-term level. You just go, something's really off about this.
Yeah. My suggestion with how to differentiate or make a modern slasher, make a better modern slasher, and I think this is really what makes Terrifier a great example of this, and you could say with Megan as well. And it's not just about the killers being interesting; it's about differentiating yourself from other slasher films.
Yes.
Where I like, because my compliment to Sick, while it is very basic, and I joke, and you kind of joke with me when I say it's good enough. They use the pandemic as a device that works to the plot, right? Like, why are they going after these girls? Because they did the contact tracing and the girls were responsible, or they believe the girls are responsible, or the girl is responsible for their son's death. They used it as a plot device, right? That's, to me, what differentiates this movie. They didn't just use COVID-19 as a setting. They used it as actual plot device, and I enjoyed that. That's what separated this from other pandemic-era movies or movies that introduced the pandemic. They actually used it as a plot device for why it happened, why it's happening to this character, and the resolution. And that's where I'm getting at with differentiating yourself. With Terrifier 2 isn't the world's most complicated plot. For a guy that comes on here, on 9 out of 10 podcasts and screams about story, that's not the most complicated story in the world. But where they differentiated themselves was with interesting enough characters, and I'm not saying they're the deepest characters, but interesting enough characters, and then a really, truly compelling killer, and then the truly awful, gruesome kills. That's what separates Terrifier and Terrifier 2, is they are just bonkers, to-the-wall kills. And it's not for the faint of heart, right? And then they do, in the second one especially, which is why the second one, in my opinion, is superior to the first one, is they actually do introduce an interesting heroine in that film, like an interesting protagonist in that film. But differentiate yourself. That's the key. Differentiate yourself. And I know that sounds like such a broad statement, but there's a million versions of X. There's a million versions of Terrifier. There's a million versions of Megan that they try and fail miserably to actually create an interesting, different story. And Megan is not the first movie about AI. And
not the first killer robot. Yeah.
But how do they differentiate it? Well, they made a child AI. And not Chucky, like a child AI the same size as the kid. They created a plot device in that film to make it different than another killer doll or another AI robot or whatever.
Megan also has a great personality, like a genuinely interesting personality.
Yeah, so that's how they differentiate it. With Art the Clown and Terrifier, we talked about the gruesome kills, the iconic look to him. So differentiate yourself. Speak No Evil's not really a slasher film,
No.
but when you talk about the plot device, like make it make sense. Make it more if you're like when you talk about the simplicity of Sick, ultimately it's a revenge film is what it comes down to.
Yeah.
It's a revenge film. It's a set of parents trying to avenge their son's death, right? Like that's as simple as it comes. But there's a plot device involved in that, which is the whole COVID-19 pandemic. He got sick from a girl he kissed who was very flippantly just kissing guys at a party. And, in a way, they're slut shaming. There's a lot of things going on with why they're doing this, right? And they're putting the blame on her. They put no blame on their son, right? Like that goes back to the moral
Yeah.
of this movie. They're not blaming him for doing this. They're blaming her for doing this. But again, they're using that as a plot device, and that's how it's differentiating. And that's what makes it a different COVID-19 kind of film. Um, Differentiate yourself in any way, shape, or form. Make it something that's different than what you've already seen on film 1,000 times. Don't just make yourself another hockey mask style killer. Why do we care? We've already seen that movie. You know what I mean?
Don't.
That's where not to go back and like rehash our review on the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, but they tried to remake the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, but then they tried to go too far. They tried to introduce all these weird elements and backstory and all these like little things they tried to differentiate themselves, and it didn't work. None of it worked. Differentiate yourselves in a way that works. Whether it's Art the Clown, whether it's a child AI, whether it's a plot device like the COVID-19 pandemic being why the killer is seeking to kill somebody. Differentiate yourself in a way that sets you apart from every other film that's going to land in theaters or land on demand.
Don't be simple. Don't be basic. Don't be good enough. I couldn't agree more, Damon.
No, being simple and being good enough is because they do use what I just said. They use a plot device that actually works and differentiates it from other slasher films.
I think I don't necessarily agree there. I mean I think they just used it, but they didn't make it interesting. It's used, sure, but it's not used very interestingly. Like you can use a baton as a back scratcher. It's more interesting if you twirl it. You know what I mean? Like I think that's my problem with Sick. If they would have made those killers or the girls super interesting, one of the two things, they would have had me. That's all they needed. They just didn't go either way for me. The killers weren't interesting, and she wasn't. Our Parker wasn't interesting, and poor Miri was pretty much just in the background, just fodder, But she was there to save the day. So unfortunately, on those aspects, the killer, the protagonist, neither were interesting. So even though the plot device made sense, it doesn't make it good.
And I disagree. I think it was actually good and well done and made sense when it all came together, because when you watch this film and you see it all come together, when you're in the moment and you see the beginning of the film and you see these girls going to the lake house, you're kind of curious why this is happening. And that's a big part of a lot of slashers. Why is this happening to me? Right? Happens in My Bloody Valentine, happens in a lot of the great slashers. Why is this happening? Why is the killer coming after us? Happened in Scream. We didn't know for the longest time why somebody was coming after Sidney Prescott. They didn't reveal that until the very end when Billy Loomis finally tells her why he started this whole plot against Sidney Prescott. In this film, it's kind of the same way. When you finally get it to the point of the unraveling of why they're going after her and also why it's set during the COVID-19 pandemic, it all makes sense. And that's why I say all the pieces come together, and I really enjoyed that little twist at the end. It wasn't overly complicated. They didn't try to make it like there's a version of this film where they overcomplicate the plot and it gets really convoluted and stupid. But they just did it. They used social media to track down the girl who kissed their son who gave him COVID. They proved that she had COVID. They did that. They tested her and said, "You're asymptomatic. You have it," and you gave it to our son, and he died 3 days ago or whatever it was, however many days ago it was. and they use it as a plot device. And so that's where I said they differentiate themselves. Could there have been better parts? Sure. Could there have been better killers? Sure. Could there have been more character development? Sure. But overall, for what I said, simple, effective, and good enough, it works. Because I don't need this to be an Oscar. I don't need this to be an Oscar level slasher. I don't need this to be X, which was my number 2 film of 2022. It's just an effective enough slasher because again, there's a million versions of this same movie that don't work, and they get it completely wrong.
Yeah, I just think it wasn't that interesting. Ultimately, like whether all those things are in place, it still didn't equal an interesting movie for me.
But going back to the last thing I said about the slasher, whatever it is you're doing, differentiate yourself in a way that doesn't make you like every other slasher.
Right? Don't do the scream ending.
X did that. X did that. X. Don't do the scream ending?
Yeah. Hey, sick. Don't do the scream ending. Oh
Uh,
wait, you did it.
who wrote Scream? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, it's weird that somebody who did the scream ending would do the scream ending again in a whole other movie.
Uh,
David, I'm so glad we have YouTube now because you could see David
no.
being irritated.
I'm saying you do realize that like killers killing people and then revealing why they're killing you is kind of a point of a lot of horror films. You do realize
Sure, no, totally. I just this is where we're ultimately going to disagree. Where it doesn't matter how this, where that. I just didn't find it interesting. You did, I didn't. I just went, well, okay,
what
I
I say.
see.
When
Because
I
I
go
did
back,
say everything's logical. Like I didn't go, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. I go, no, everything lines up. This is just not interesting.
yeah, and I disagree. I thought it was interesting, but also to my larger point about slasher films, when I say differentiate yourself in a way that makes it cohesive, makes it make sense, and makes it a plot device that works. Whether that is the interesting killer, whether that is the interesting kills, whether that is the interesting plot twist, make it something that differentiates yourself. And this film used COVID-19 in a way that actually made sense. X used slashers and used a set of a porn film of all things
Yeah, great
to
setting, great kills, great
execute
characters, great character
execute
development.
execute an interesting plot device. Terrifier 2. It's not the deepest plot in the world. It's not the deepest characters in the world, but they use the killer and the kills to really sell the story. So again, that's my point. And while I do agree with your holy triumvirate of what makes a great slasher film, um, there are plenty of elements of other films that hit one of three or two or three or none of three and they still work. I think it's the slasher. I think the problem is with slashers, and this happened in the '80s, and I think we both agree on this, is that when Halloween worked and then Friday the 13th worked, everyone just
Oh, sure.
you know copied that formula. Never on Elm Street turned it on its head because they went to a different device, a supernatural dream killer kind of device. They went to that, but then again, you churn out another 1,000 that are so generic and whatever. And there's some well done ones in there. Like I said, My Bloody Valentine is one of my favorite '80s slashers. It's not the most complicated plot in the world.
Damon, one of my favorites of all time. Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. Not the greatest movie. Like, not really. Not very good. Not the most interesting. Very interesting killer. Very interesting protagonist. But as a movie, not very good. Sometimes I saw this on Twitter today and I was like, wow, this is like, I love this. This is genius. And I'm paraphrasing, but they were basically like, you don't always have to defend something as good. You can just defend it as you really fucking liked it. Like that's a valid way to talk about movies. And I want to encourage that more and more and more, where the discussion doesn't need to be, was it good or was it bad? It's like, no, here's why I liked it and here's why I didn't. Which is, I feel like we're successful at that. Like that's something that I think, I don't even consider you and I reviewers necessarily. I think we're two like hardcore fans who love talking about why something does or doesn't work for us, as opposed to going, here's why you should like it. Here's why it's correct. Here's why it's right. I don't even worry about any of that stuff. I go, here's why it really worked for me, or here's why it really didn't. And that's it. And you say it at the end of every one of these. You always tell people, go out there, see it for yourself, check it out, decide, see what you think, and let us know. Because that's the way we really should be playing the discourse when it comes to talk about movies.
Absolutely, 100% agree because art is not definitive. what you
Sometimes it ain't even art. Sometimes it's
I
just
joke, I
dog
joke,
shit, but I love it anyway.
I joke, and I use Midsommar as my beating post a lot on this show. But I know people I respect and people I have a ton of respect for love that movie, and they think it's brilliant. And I had one friend who called it the best movie he's seen in 20 years. I completely disagree, but I agree with. And again, I mean, look at a movie. This is not a horror movie, but my favorite film of 2022 was a film called Babylon.
That's a good
critics
movie.
critics have shit all over that film. I mean, they're like, it's not gotten good reviews.
Yeah.
It's not been. It's long. It's blah blah blah. I've heard a million critics say it's this, it's that. I don't like it. I loved it. For me, I loved it. I don't know if you'll love it. I'll tell you, I'll recommend you to watch it because I loved it, and here's why I loved it. But if you don't love it, that's fine. And there's going to be a lot of people who are going to disagree. Like I said, I read reviews for X. I read reviews for Terrifier. I read reviews for Speak No Evil that said this was a dumb movie and they didn't get it. They didn't like it. That's
That
okay.
person should get their reviewer card taken away. That's my opinion.
What I say though is like art is not
Subjective.
it's subjective. It's not black or white. You know what I mean? There's shades of gray with every bit of art, and what you find what you love and what I hate doesn't necessarily mean someone else is going to love or hate it. So yeah, you're right. Even with Sick or any other movie review on here, we give our opinion and we're telling you why we like or dislike a movie or what worked for us, what didn't work for us. But as I always say, go judge for yourself. Judge for yourself. And again, you might agree totally with Patrick and say, "Man, Patrick, you were 100% right," or you might say, "Damon, I know what you're talking about, and you were right, and Patrick was wrong." That's fine. We disagree on this one. Guess what? We agree on a lot of films. We disagree.
Ooh,
You know,
I'm encouraging someone out there to make a Twitter poll. By the way, have enough followers to make an interesting Twitter poll. Put a Twitter poll on. Go. Who was right about Sick, Damon or Patrick? And I just want to see what it does. I don't even care. I don't care what the outcome is. I just want to see what people think about that.
I have a feeling I know which way it would sway, judging by the reviews I've seen.
Ah.
A lot of people like this movie, Patrick. I think
A lot of people like it, but I'm the most right person there ever was.
I think you might be in the minority on this one.
I might, and I'm on the. Actually, I find myself on the minority in a lot of ways. I'm not a contrarian, not at all. I give everything a fair shake. I really do, but I have a type. I have a like. I definitely have a standard for movies that, except for like the outliers, like a Friday the 13th 7. That's not a good movie on most levels. On a couple of levels it works, but most levels it doesn't. It doesn't matter. I still like it, and that's what I want for everybody. I want everybody to go out and go, you know what? This movie not that great, but I loved it.
Yeah. Well, you liked Men, so I mean, I guess there's some
I did like Men. I did. I liked Men.
Everyone's got their own problems.
I liked it.
Let's close out with our last category. As always, Patrick, is it scary? And I'll go first because I know your answer. Is it scary? Here's why I say it's scary in a way is because there's good tension in this movie, and that's what I like. The tension in this movie in the cat and mouse chase scenes, which make up 2/3 of the movie. Everything else we've talked about, the plot devices and the COVID-19 pandemic stuff and everything else, most of that doesn't even matter because it's just two girls being chased by killers. That's the biggest part of this movie. That's 2/3 of the movie. You could ignore a lot of the other parts of this movie and just enjoy that part of it. And there are good tension filled moments. It's a cat and mouse game, and like any good cat and mouse slasher, there's moments where the girls get away. There's moments where they don't get away, and that works for me. Is it the scariest film? Is it filled with jump scares and things? No, it's not that. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend it is. But it's good tension, and so in that regard, it's not scary, but there's good tension. So I'd say it's scary in that regard.
Yeah, and is it scary? I'm gonna strictly rank it against and compare it against other slashers because I think that genre needs to deliver certain things. I'm gonna say no, it's not scary. I don't think it delivers on thrills or chills or even great kills necessarily. So for me, it's not scary, but that probably came as no surprise to you.
As I said, I knew your answer before you even said it. Sick is available right now on Peacock. As we always say, go check it out for yourself, see what you think. it is Kevin Williamson, the writer from Scream, so go check it out. It's a very short movie, 83 minutes. You can get through it pretty quickly, so go check it out. It's on Peacock. Of course, we got a lot of other new movies coming out in the near future we will review and probably agree or disagree on, because we got one big one coming up in a couple weeks called Infinity Pool from Brandon Cronenberg, and I have a feeling that's going to be a very divisive movie.
We're gonna find out.
It seems very much in Patrick's wheelhouse and not so much in mine. So we will see how that one. We might be having the opposite conversation.
We might.
We will see how that goes. We also have Knock at the Cabin, the new M. Night Shyamalan movie.
Looking forward to it.
You and I have both agreed we are big M. Night Shyamalan film
Yes.
fans. So that's coming up, so stay tuned for that. As always, we appreciate everyone tuning in. Make sure you check us out on all of your favorite podcast platforms: Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, Amazon, and of course now we are on YouTube.
Yes.
Go search youtube.com at Rewind of the Living Dead, and you will find us over there. Every new episode will be uploaded, and we will soon be uploading past episodes as well. So go to YouTube, subscribe to the podcast, and look forward to this week to week on the podcast. So we appreciate everyone that continues to support us over there and subscribe to our new YouTube channel. If you have questions, comments, movies you'd like us to review, if you want to tell Patrick why he's so wrong about Sick, you can send us messages through email at rotlivingdead@gmail.com. That's rot. livingdead@gmail.com. You can also message us on any of our own social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Just search Rewind of the Living Dead. You'll find us over there. We are Rewind of Living Dead or Rewind of Dead on every social media platform, depending on spacing. Rewind of Dead is over on Twitter because we only have so many characters to work with. Rewind of Living Dead or Rewind of the Living Dead on Facebook and or Instagram. And you can also message us on our own personal social media platforms. I am at Damon Martin, and you are?
At Director Patrick.
And we want to say a big thank you, as always, to everyone that tunes into the show. We'll be back with a new episode of Rewind of the Living Dead next week. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you then.
Subscribe and smash that like.